Let's dive right into this explainer. We're looking at what is absolutely one of the most ambitious industrial turnarounds in modern economic history. For decades, the story of Japan's semiconductor industry was kind of viewed as a cautionary tale of slow decline. But today, we are looking at a massive, state-backed renaissance. We're going to explore how a nation is literally re-architecting its technological sovereignty from the ground up, completely abandoning a passive laissez-faire approach for highly targeted, aggressive industrial policy. To really grasp the sheer scale of the crisis that triggered the shift, picture this. In the 1980s, Japan was an absolute juggernaut. They were producing nearly half of the world's semiconductor chips, the very chips that power everything from our cars to our smartphones. They completely dominated in memory and high-yield manufacturing. But by the 2010s, that massive 50% slice of the global pie had shriveled to just about 10%. That is a staggering loss of global market share and ultimately technological leverage. So how on earth did they fall so far? And more importantly, how are they clawing their way back? Here is how we're breaking down this multi-trillion yen turnaround today. 1. The fall from dominance. 2. Japan's three-step strategy. 3. The Renesas rescue mission. 4. Turnaround and reprivatization. And 5. Navigating future challenges. Let's start with part 1, the fall from dominance, structural shocks and market retreat. So, how exactly did they lose their grip? Well, Japan's lead was dismantled by a rapid, brutal succession of structural shocks. It started with intense geopolitical and trade pressure, specifically the 1986 U.S.-Japan Semiconductor Agreement and the 100% tariffs slapped on by the Reagan administration. Then, the Plaza Accord in the 90s caused the yen to appreciate wildly, making Japanese exports incredibly expensive globally. But, perhaps the most fatal blow was strategic. Japanese megacorporations stubbornly refused to adopt the specialized fabless foundry model that Taiwan and others were pioneering. They just kept doing everything in-house. This slow bleed ultimately culminated in 2012 when Elpida Memory went bankrupt, a deeply symbolic retreat of Japanese giants from cutting-edge production. Which brings us to part 2, Japan's three-step strategy, the policy solution. Fast forward to the early 2020s. With global supply chains melting down and auto factories literally halting assembly lines because they couldn't get their hands on a basic $2 chip, the Japanese government realized the hands-off approach just wasn't working anymore. It was time for a massive pivot toward economic security, and their financial commitment here is absolutely immense. They didn't just toss out a few minor tax breaks. They allocated 3.9 trillion yen. That's roughly $27 billion just between 2021 and 2023 alone. To put that into perspective, as 0.71% of their GDP, it vastly exceeds the scale of both the US and European CHIPS Acts. And they aren't stopping there. They've got a much larger 10 trillion yen framework extending through 2030, custom designed to aggressively re-onshore their entire chip ecosystem. Now, the Ministry of Economy, Trade and Industry, or METI, didn't just throw money at the wall. They laid out this incredibly aggressive, chronological three-step playbook. Step 1 is stopping the bleeding by building up legacy and mature nodes to feed the immediate critical needs of their auto industry through the JASM project. Step 2 is incredibly ambitious, a total leapfrog over intermediate technologies directly to bleeding-edge 2-nanometer chips via a brand new company called Rapidus. And Step 3 is aiming for sheer dominance in next-generation disrupted technologies, specifically looking to replace traditional electrical interconnects with photonics. If we contrast those first 2 steps, you can really see the dual-track genius of this strategy. On one side, JASM down in Kumamoto is a joint venture with TSMC producing legacy chips. The strategy here is purely defensive. They want to stabilize supply chains immediately, so Toyota and other essential domestic manufacturers never face a shutdown again. But on the other side, Rapidus is pure offense. Partnering with IBM and iMac, they are trying to bypass everything and go straight to 2-nanometer logic. The goal? Securing global leadership in AI and supercomputing. It's a staggering 5 trillion yen bet to catch up to the rest of the world in one giant, highly calculated leap. Let's move on to part 3, the Renesas rescue mission, or the microcrisis. It's one thing to talk about macro policy, but it's another to see how it actually plays out in the trenches, with real, company-ending stakes. Take Renesas. Formed in 2010 through a mega merger of legacy chip divisions, they were an absolute giant in automotive microcontrollers, literally the computing brains of the modern cars we drive. But they inherited deeply fragmented factories and crippling fixed costs. Then, a perfect storm hit. In 2011, the devastating 9.0 earthquake physically wrecked their critical Naka plant.
Later that same year, massive floods in Thailand completely wiped out their downstream assembly lines. By 2012, they were bleeding cash, holding enormous overhead, and pushed to the absolute brink of insolvency. Suddenly, U.S. private equity firm KKR came circling with a buyout bid. The prospect of losing the computing brains behind Japan's most vital economic engine, its automotive industry, forced a drastic decision. The defining challenge for Japanese policymakers became this: how do you save a critical national asset from a potential foreign asset strip, but do it without permanently nationalizing the company and completely destroying its long-term market competitiveness?
The answer to that question arrived in 2013, and it came with an eye-watering price tag: 150 billion yen. The state-backed Innovation Network Corporation of Japan, or INCJ, swooped in and injected this massive sum of capital to acquire a controlling 69.15% equity stake in Renesas. This was a decisive maneuver that completely blocked the private equity bid and put the Japanese government firmly in the driver's seat. But here's the key: that 150 billion yen wasn't just some blank check bailout. It was patient capital. This is long-term investment, specifically designed to absorb the heavy shock of deep, painful structural reforms. We're talking about closing out dated factories, laying off redundant workers, and entirely shifting business models. These are absolute survival tactics that short-term stock markets or private equity flippers usually won't support because they take years to actually show results. The state stepped in to act as a temporary, heavily funded shield.
On to part 4, turnaround and reprivatization, the execution. So what did CEO Hidetoshi Shibata and his management team do with that patient capital? They definitely didn't waste it. First, they aggressively consolidated redundant domestic fabs to slash those fixed costs. To survive future earthquakes without crippling global auto manufacturing, they partnered with TSMC to create fab-ready backups. Basically, if a Japanese plant went down, TSMC could instantly start printing their chips overseas. Once the defensive foundation was laid, they went on a massive offensive, spending billions acquiring global companies like Intercell, IDT, and Dialog. This allowed Renesas to sell entirely integrated hardware systems, which they called winning combinations, breaking them out of the trap of just selling basic, low-margin microcontrollers.
The financial success of this strategy is just incredible. Within a couple of years of this new defensive and offensive playbook taking hold, Renesas operating margins nearly doubled, jumping from 19.2% in 2020 to a massive 37.2% by 2022. During the same window, their revenues soared past 1.5 trillion yen. They had effectively gone from a distressed asset on the verge of bankruptcy to a highly profitable, resilient global powerhouse. And because the company became massively profitable, the state could execute a beautifully phased exit back to private markets over 10 years, avoiding any sudden shocks to the stock price. Starting at nearly 70% in 2013, they stepped their stake down to 50% by 2017. By 2022, Renesas was generating so much free cash flow they actually bought back their own shares from the government. Finally, in November 2023, the state fund completely exited, dropping their stake to absolute zero. That final block trade exit in 2023 was worth 279 billion yen. This whole saga proves that this public-private partnership was a massive, unqualified success. The state didn't just save a critical company and preserve domestic IP. They generated significant net returns for the state treasury. And crucially, they are now recycling those exact funds directly into the new frontier, specifically funding that ambitious 2-nanometer Rapidus project we talked about earlier. Which brings us to our final section, Part 5, Navigating Future Challenges, the Macro Future. So while the Renesas story is a tightly closed loop of success, the broader macro strategy of Japan's chip renaissance is really just getting started, and they are staring down some steep mountains. First, decades of industry decline mean there is a severe shortage of specialized engineering talent. You can build the most advanced factory in the world, but you still need highly trained humans to run it. Second, leaping directly from 40-nanometer legacy tech all the way to 2-nanometer logic with Rapidus introduces staggering execution and capital risks. I mean, we are talking 5 trillion yen just to reach mass production. Finally, Japanese equipment makers are caught squarely in the crossfire of complex geopolitical friction and strict US-led global export controls, heavily restricting where they can actually sell their most advanced tech. Which leaves us with a truly massive question to consider. As the global chip race accelerates and supply chain security becomes completely synonymous with national security, is Japan's unique model the new global standard?
deploying heavy, patient state capital to force restructuring, but maintaining the strict discipline to step back and fully reprivatize when the job is done. Is this the exact blueprint that other nations will inevitably copy to secure their own technological sovereignty? It's a question that will undoubtedly define the global tech economy for the next decade. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking the big questions.